This is my new 2022 Giant Trance 29.1, which I paid full retail for of $3,700 at time of filming. The Trance was updated for 2022 with new geometry and longer travel, so let's go ahead and take a look at this aluminum trail bike offering from Giant. And before we get started, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you aren't already. Thank you, please do that now. The Trance is a 120mm travel trail bike, up last year from 115mm, I know, big deal, and it is paired to a 130mm travel fork. It is offered in this build that you see here, or the more affordable Trance 2 for $2,600. I was actually pretty interested in the more affordable option, but they didn't have any available at the time, and I cannot be bothered with patience. I don't have any. It's a pretty impressive build for under $3,000, which is getting really difficult to find these days. Not to be confused with the Trance X, that is this bike's longer travel big brother with 150mm out front and 135mm out back. Then if the Trance or Trance X has the word advanced in its name, that implies that the frame is carbon fiber instead of aluminum. If that wasn't enough, there's a cheaper Stance model, which is the same travel as the Trance, but it's not the same frame and it uses cheaper parts. Not the most sensible or straightforward model lineup, so hopefully that clears things up for you a bit if you were confused, but let's go ahead and talk about this bike specifically. Geometry is the big update this year and it now includes a flip chip. It's currently in the low position and it's probably going to stay there, but I do plan on filming a video comparing the differences between the two geometry positions with some timed climbing and descending to see if there actually is a difference between the two or if I can even really notice. Stay tuned to the next year, that'll be out. I am 6 foot tall with a 32-inch inseam, and this bike is a size large, and in the low position right now it has a 65.5 degree head tube angle paired to a 76.3 degree seat tube angle. Flip that to the high setting, you're gonna get a 66.2 degree head tube angle with a 77 degree seat tube angle. Other notable numbers in the low position: 472mm reach, 439mm chainstay length, and a wheelbase of 1,224mm. None of those numbers are exactly what I would call radical, and that's why I love this thing. On paper, this bike is very similar to my previous bike, the Trek Top Fuel 8, but this bike is just a smidge longer, lower, and slacker, and those are the only 3 words that matter in mountain biking. Yes, I sold the Trek Top Fuel. This bike is its replacement. On to the specs, this bike uses a Fox 34 performance up front with a Fox DPS performance out back, and fun fact, I've never owned a bike with Fox suspension. I don't have a bias against Fox, it's just every bike I've bought in the last few years came with RockShox. Drivetrain is a full Shimano SLX 12-speed, which is nice to see, and while the website states it has Shimano MT520 4-piston brakes, mine was spec'd with Tektro Orion 4-piston brakes. I was kind of excited to see them as I've never used anything other than Tektro's really entry-level brakes, and so far they're performing quite well. Not as much initial bite as a Shimano brake, but it also doesn't require as much modulation as some SRAM brakes, so in my opinion it's kind of a happy medium between the two. Will they last and perform long term? I don't know, I guess time will tell. The levers are a little bit longer than I'm used to, but I'm getting along just fine with these. Wheels, handlebars, stem, saddle, grips, and the dropper post are all Giant branded. The dropper post is 170mm of travel on this size large, but I'm actually going to donate this post to my Giant Fathom hardtail because I do have a 200mm post on the way for this bike. I've already replaced the grips with my favorite Deity grips, the saddle has been changed to my Ergon saddle that I love, and I took the Hunt wheels off my Trek Top Fuel and put them on this bike. The Trance does come spec'd with a Maxxis Minion DHF up front and a Maxxis Aggressor out back, both in a 2.5-inch width, but I decided to swap those out and try out Vittoria tires for the first time. I went with the Bartzo out back in a 2.35-inch width, and then I went with the Agaro or Ajaro out front in a 2.6-inch width. And if you speak Italian, please let me know if I pronounce those correctly. I went with the gray sidewalls on these tires. You probably can't tell too much because they're kind of dirty, to match the gray grips, which match the gray lettering on the bike. As you can see, I went for a colored theme here, and I'm clearly pulling it off. What do you think? Other details to note on this bike: it can fit a water bottle, has 2 extra bosses under the top tube to store tools or whatever you want, nice down tube protection, chainstay protection, and internal cable routing. And I'm giving it bonus points because they don't run underneath the bottom bracket. Obviously with this bike I lose the internal down tube storage that the Trek had. Yes, I'm a little sad about it, but I think I will overcome. My 2 minor gripes that I say in pretty much every video: it came with resin-only pads and rotors, and this bike uses a press-fit bottom bracket. Out of the box with pedals, setup tubeless, and all the stock parts, this bike weighed 33.46 pounds. As it currently sits with all these upgrades, it weighs 32.32 pounds. I've owned this bike for a little over a month now, and I'm getting along really well with it. My first couple rides on this bike, I immediately noticed how much more plush it was than the Trek Top Fuel. Like riding on a cloud was the expression I used at the time. While the Top Fuel was firm and responsive to pedal inputs, the Trance doesn't feel that far off. People often praise Giant's Maestro suspension design for being a very efficient pedaler and also being fairly active while descending, and I see what they mean. On my typical climb up to Train, I couldn't believe how quickly I was ripping up that hill. Maybe it was just new bike stoke, but I felt like a streamlined cheetah going up that climb. I wish I would have rode this and my Trek back to back and timed it, did something like that, but that opportunity never presented itself because it's hot and kind of lazy. Descending on this bike feels so great. As I mentioned earlier, it just feels so plush. This rear shock absorbs all types of different bumps so delicately. My back hurts a lot less riding this bike through rougher terrain than it did on the Trek, so that's pretty nice. The Trek did feel slightly faster downhill because it wasn't using its travel as actively as this bike, but you'll probably make up that time in some chunky stuff because this bike feels a lot more supportive through that. There's a little more confidence on this bike too in that chunky stuff just because the wheelbase is a little bit longer, the head tube angle is about half a degree slacker. I know that doesn't sound like much, but it does make a big difference when you're plowing through some chunky rocks. I do think the Trek was a little bit more playful off of jumps than this bike. That's probably due to the fact the Trek had a slightly shorter chainstay and it used the RockShox suspension. A lot of people say RockShox is a little bit more poppy than Fox suspension. I don't think I've spent enough time on this suspension to make that judgment, but if you're in the comments and you've ridden both pretty frequently, let me know your thoughts on that. Is RockShox a little more poppy, Fox a little more plush? Please debate in the comments. With the Fox 34, I do feel a little bit more flex than I would like to on larger impacts. I also have an easier time bottoming this fork out, but I'm not going to criticize that part too much because I still need to add some volume spacers to it before I pass judgment. I really like the way the DPS shock feels out back, but one major annoyance I have with it is the compression lever. The fully open position is to the side here, as you can see, but it's so delicate and flimsy that it often moves itself into the trail setting over rough terrain. I've looked down at my shock several times while riding because the bike felt a little bit harsher than it should, and lo and behold, the lever had moved. Why isn't this position fully open, or why didn't they use a tighter interface on this lever? The world may never know. If you too have a DPS shock on your bike, make sure you're actively checking this to make sure you're getting full use of your shock. All the other components on this bike are working perfectly fine, and my initial impressions of this bike are very positive. It's no secret that I really liked my Trek Top Fuel. This bike feels very similar to it, but it's also just slightly more capable downhill, and it just so happens to cost $300 less. This is a pretty impressive bike and value, if you ask me, which you did, because you're watching my video. This new Trance is a really competitive offering from Giant, and it may be one of the best value aluminum trail bikes from a bike shop brand available right now. I spend an obscene amount of time researching bikes, always looking for the best value or the best bang for your buck, and in all my research, this bike had me in a trance. Ooh, that's some really cringy riding that you've come to expect from this channel, and I like to think that's why you stick around, you sick weirdo. I'm just kidding, you're none of those things, viewer on the other side of this screen. I like to think you're a very nice person, and I look forward to meeting you someday. Let me know down in the comments what bikes you think are the best value of 2022. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and until the next one, stay rowdy within reason.